June 22nd, 1941, 3:15 in the morning. Along a frontier stretching nearly 2,000 miles from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, German artillery opened fire. The barrage lit up the pre-dawn darkness like lightning across the entire length of the Soviet Union's western border. 3 million German troops and nearly 700,000 Axis soldiers began crossing into Soviet territory in what would become the largest military invasion in human history. Operation Barbarossa had begun. In Moscow, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov was summoned to the German embassy at 4 in the morning. The German ambassador handed him a declaration of war. Molotov rushed back to the Kremlin and found Joseph Stalin in his office. The Soviet dictator listened as Molotov delivered the news that Germany had just invaded. Stalin sat in stunned silence. Reports suggest he couldn't speak for several minutes, simply staring at Molotov as though the words made no sense. When he finally found his voice, his first response wasn't to issue military orders or call his generals. His first words were a question that revealed the depth of his miscalculation. Do they think we deserved this? Stalin had convinced himself that Hitler wouldn't attack. He had ignored every warning from his intelligence services. British intelligence had sent alerts. Soviet spies had sent detailed reports about German troop movements along the border. Even specific invasion dates had been provided by multiple sources. Stalin dismissed it all as fake news, as incompetence by Soviet agents, as a sinister plot by British intelligence to start a war between Germany and the USSR. He believed the British wanted to use the Soviets as pawns to fight Germany while Britain stood back and watched. Stalin's delusion ran so deep that when Soviet border guards reported massive artillery fire and advancing German troops, Stalin's initial response was to order them not to fire back. He thought it might be a provocation, an unauthorized action by rogue German commanders, something that could still be negotiated and diffused. It couldn't. Within hours, the Luftwaffe had destroyed more than 3,000 Soviet aircraft, roughly half the entire Soviet Air Force, most of them caught on the ground before pilots could even reach their planes. German panzer divisions advanced up to 60 miles into Soviet territory on the first day. Soviet forces, caught completely unprepared, offered confused and disorganized resistance. The Red Army's command structure collapsed under the shock of the surprise attack. Within weeks, German forces had captured hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, seized vast quantities of weapons and supplies, and advanced 400 miles toward Moscow. Stalin's betrayal of his own military by refusing to prepare for attack nearly ended the Soviet Union. The Germans came within sight of the Kremlin spires before the advance finally stalled that winter. This betrayal changed the course of World War II and human history. But it began 2 years earlier, in August 1939, when two dictators who despised each other shocked the world by signing a pact of friendship. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the Soviet and German foreign ministers who signed it on August 23, 1939, was supposed to guarantee 10 years of peace between Nazi Germany and the Communist Soviet Union. These were ideological enemies. Hitler had built his entire political career on hatred of Bolshevism. The Nazis and Communists had fought each other in the streets of German cities during the 1920s and 30s. Stalin viewed fascism as capitalism's last desperate gasp before the inevitable communist revolution. They should have been natural enemies to the death. Instead, they signed a treaty promising not to attack each other and secretly dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of honesty to influence. Germany would take Western Poland. The Soviet Union would take Eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of Romania. The pact freed Hitler to invade Poland without fear of Soviet intervention, which he did 1 week later, starting World War II. For Stalin, the pact was a strategic masterstroke, or so he convinced himself. He believed he'd bought time for the Soviet Union to prepare for the inevitable war with Germany, while watching Germany exhaust itself fighting Britain and France in the West. Stalin thought Hitler was rational, that the German dictator understood that fighting a two-front war would be suicidal, that the pact represented genuine German interest in avoiding conflict with the USSR until the war in the West was finished. Stalin surrounded himself with yes-men who dared not contradict him. By 1939, he was the center of a personality cult that treated him as infallible, as possessing almost supernatural wisdom and foresight. Stalin started believing his own propaganda. So when German troop concentrations began appearing along the Soviet border in early 1941, when German reconnaissance flights violated Soviet airspace dozens of times, when Stalin's own intelligence officers warned him that invasion was imminent, the Soviet dictator refused to believe it. He had another incentive for self-delusion. Admitting that war was coming would mean admitting that Stalin had been wrong about the pact, about Hitler's intentions, about his own judgment. And in Stalin's Soviet Union, suggesting that Stalin could be wrong about anything was extremely unhealthy. Officials learned to tell Stalin what he wanted to hear rather than risk his fury by contradicting him. The result of this willful blindness was catastrophe. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, Soviet forces were positioned incorrectly, supplied inadequately, and commanded by officers too terrified to take initiative without explicit orders from Moscow. The Germans achieved total surprise, despite the fact that the invasion involved 3 million men, thousands of tanks and aircraft, and logistics that should have been impossible to hide. Stalin had handed Hitler the perfect conditions for a successful surprise attack. The Soviet Union survived, but barely. Millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians died in the first months of the war. Moscow came within days of falling. Leningrad endured a siege that lasted nearly 900 days and killed more than 1 million people through starvation and bombardment. The betrayal nearly worked. Hitler came terrifyingly close to destroying the Soviet Union and achieving his dream of an empire in the East. Before we continue exploring the deadliest betrayals in history, I want to tell you about this channel. We bring you real stories from the past every single day, the kind of history that reveals how trust gets weaponized, how allies become enemies, how a single act of treachery can change the fate of millions. If you're fascinated by the moments when everything hinges on loyalty or betrayal, when one person's decision reshapes the world, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, what's coming next will show you that Hitler's betrayal of Stalin, as massive as it was, represents just one pattern in a history full of calculated treachery. We're going to explore betrayals that inspired Game of Thrones, betrayals that destroyed ancient empires, betrayals that decided which nations would dominate Europe, and betrayals where personal secrets led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands. The patterns repeat throughout history, and understanding them helps you see how power actually works. Oh, and quick question. Where are you listening from right now? Drop your city and country in the comments below. It's always amazing to see how these stories reach people across the world. Are you listening from Moscow, where Stalin made his catastrophic miscalculation? Berlin, where Hitler planned his betrayal? Maybe New York, Tokyo, London, or Sydney? Let me know. I read every comment. Now, let's go back in time. Let's go back 500 years before Hitler and Stalin, to Scotland in 1440, to a betrayal so shocking that it would inspire one of television's most memorable scenes centuries later. Edinburgh Castle, November 24th, 1440. 10-year-old King James II of Scotland sat at the head of a grand banquet table in the castle's great hall. The boy king had been orphaned 3 years earlier when his father, James I, was brutally assassinated by rival nobles. Since then, Scotland had been governed by regents, powerful men who ruled in the child's name while competing for control of the kingdom. Tonight, the young king was hosting a special dinner, and his guests of honor were 2 brothers from Scotland's most powerful family, 16-year-old William Douglas, the 6th Earl of Douglas, and his younger brother David. The Douglas clan had dominated Scottish politics for generations. They controlled vast estates across southern Scotland, commanded private armies, and wielded more practical power than the crown itself. William Douglas, despite his youth, led this formidable family. He'd inherited the earldom just a year earlier when his father died. Now he sat at dinner with King James II, surrounded by nobles, with servants bringing course after course of roasted meats, fresh bread, wine, and delicacies befitting a royal feast. The atmosphere seemed cordial. The boy king appeared happy to have guests near his own age. The Douglas brothers were enjoying themselves. And then, as the feast reached its height, servants carried in a covered dish and placed it directly in front of William Douglas. They removed the cover. Sitting on the plate was the severed head of a black bull. The hall went silent. Everyone at that table knew what the black bull's head meant. It was an ancient Scottish symbol of death, a sign that the person before whom it was placed was condemned. William Douglas looked at the bull's head, then at the men around him, and understood immediately that he and his brother had walked into a trap. Before the young earl could react, armed men seized him and his brother. The 10-year-old king reportedly began crying and pleading for his guests to be released, but his pleas were ignored. William and David Douglas were dragged out of the great hall to Castle Hill outside the fortress. There, they were subjected to a mock trial orchestrated by Sir William Crichton, the Chancellor of Scotland, and Sir Alexander Livingston, who controlled access to the Child King. The charges were treason against the crown. The trial lasted minutes. The verdict was predetermined. Both brothers were found guilty and sentenced to death. William Douglas, 16 years old, reportedly begged his executioners to kill his younger brother first so that David wouldn't have to watch his older brother die. The request was granted. David Douglas was beheaded on Castle Hill. Then William Douglas was executed. Their bodies were left where they fell as a warning to anyone who might challenge the men who truly controlled Scotland. The 10-year-old king, traumatized by what he'd witnessed, could do nothing. He was a puppet. The real power belonged to the men who'd just murdered his dinner guests in front of him. The Black Dinner, as it became known, represented one of history's most egregious violations of hospitality. In medieval Scotland, as in most societies, there were sacred rules about host and guest. Once you invited someone into your home, you were honor bound to protect them. Murdering your guests was considered one of the darkest acts imaginable, a betrayal not just of the individuals, but of the social codes that made civilization possible. Yet Crichton and Livingston calculated that eliminating the Douglas brothers was worth violating those codes. They feared the Douglas family's growing power and wanted to eliminate the threat before William came of age and consolidated his authority. The betrayal worked, at least temporarily. With William and David dead, the Douglas earldom passed to their great-uncle, James Douglas, who had likely been complicit in the plot all along. James, the Gross Douglas, as he became known, did nothing to avenge his murdered great-nephews. He simply took their titles and estates. The men who orchestrated the Black Dinner maintained their grip on power, but the event left a permanent stain on Edinburgh Castle's history and became one of medieval Scotland's defining moments of treachery. 5 centuries later, author George R.R. Martin was researching medieval history for his fantasy series A Song of Ice and Fire, which would become the television phenomenon Game of Thrones. Martin came across the story of the Black Dinner and was struck by how perfectly it illustrated the brutal reality of medieval power politics. He used it, along with another Scottish betrayal called the Glencoe Massacre from 1692, as the direct inspiration for the Red Wedding, one of the most shocking scenes in television history. In that fictional scene, the Stark family attends a wedding feast at the castle of their supposed allies, the Freys. At the height of the celebration, the Freys betray the rules of hospitality and slaughter their guests in a bloodbath that left viewers stunned. Martin later said, "No matter how much I make up, there's stuff in history that's just as bad or worse." The Black Dinner proves his point. The real event was arguably more disturbing than the fiction it inspired because the victims were children, and one of the witnesses was a traumatized 10-year-old king who would grow up to become King James II of Scotland, known as James of the Fiery Face, because of a prominent birthmark. That king would spend much of his adult reign trying to break the power of the Douglas clan, and in 1452 he would personally murder another Earl of Douglas by inviting him to dinner at Stirling Castle under promise of safe conduct and then stabbing him 26 times. The pattern of betrayal that began with the Black Dinner infected Scottish politics for generations. But Scotland wasn't the only place where betrayal decided the fate of nations. Let's travel back another 1,000 years to ancient Greece in 480 BC, to a mountain pass called Thermopylae, where one man's treachery allowed the Persian Empire to nearly conquer all of Greece. King Xerxes of Persia assembled the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever seen. Modern estimates suggest his army numbered somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 men, though ancient sources claimed even higher figures. This massive force was marching south through Greece, conquering or intimidating city-states as it advanced. Xerxes wanted revenge against Athens and Sparta, the two Greek cities that had defeated his father's Shattering, instead Darius Ores at the Battle of Marathon 10 years earlier. This time, the Persians would not be stopped. Standing in their way was a narrow coastal pass at Thermopylae, which means hot gates in Greek, named for the hot sulfur springs in the area. The pass was wedged between steep mountains on one side and the cliff-lined shore of the Malayan Gulf on the other, so narrow that only a few dozen men could fight side by side. King Leonidas of Sparta had positioned a force of about 7,000 Greeks at Thermopylae to hold the pass. At the core of this defensive force were 300 Spartan warriors, an elite unit that Leonidas had personally selected. He'd chosen only men who had sons because Leonidas knew the odds of survival were minimal and wanted to ensure that the bloodlines of his soldiers would continue even if the men themselves died. When Xerxes arrived at Thermopylae and saw the small Greek force blocking his path, he reportedly sent a herald to Leonidas, demanding that the Greeks hand over their weapons and surrender. Leonidas's response became legendary, molon labe, come and take them. For 2 days the Persians attacked, for 2 days they failed. The narrow pass negated every advantage the Persians had. They couldn't use their cavalry. They couldn't overwhelm the Greeks with superior numbers because only a small fraction of the Persian army could engage at once, and the Greek hoplites, heavily armored soldiers fighting in tight formation with long spears and large shields, were far superior to the more lightly armored Persian infantry at close quarters. The elite Persian unit known as the Immortals, 10,000 of the best warriors in the Persian army, threw themselves at the Greek position and were slaughtered. Xerxes, watching the battle from a golden throne on a nearby hillside, reportedly jumped to his feet multiple times in rage and frustration as his troops were repelled again and again. The Greeks held. King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, along with soldiers from other Greek cities, inflicted catastrophic casualties on the Persians while suffering relatively light losses themselves. The strategy was working perfectly. The Persians were stuck. Their vast army was useless if it couldn't get past a few thousand Greeks defending a narrow mountain pass. And then, on the evening of the second day, a local Greek man named Ephialtes approached the Persian camp and asked to speak with King Xerxes. Ephialtes was from the region of Malis, the area surrounding Thermopylae. He knew the local terrain intimately, including paths and trails that most people didn't know existed. He came to Xerxes with an offer. In exchange for a rich reward, Ephialtes would show the Persians a mountain path called the Thermopylae Pass that led around the Greek position at Thermopylae. The path wound through the mountains and emerged behind the Greek defensive line, which would allow the Persians to attack Leonidas from both front and rear simultaneously, crushing the Greek force between two armies. Xerxes immediately understood the value of this information. He dispatched a force under the command of Hydarnes, one of his best generals, to follow Ephialtes through the mountain pass that night. The contingent of Persian troops successfully navigated the path in darkness. At dawn on the third day, they emerged behind the Greek lines, catching by surprise a unit of 1,000 Phocian Greeks who'd been stationed to guard the mountain path. The Phocians, realizing they were badly outnumbered, retreated to a nearby hilltop to make a defensive stand. The Persians simply bypassed them and continued their advance toward the rear of Leonidas's main force. A runner brought word to Leonidas that the Persians had found a way around Thermopylae and were about to surround his entire army. The Spartan king called a council of war. The situation was hopeless. If the Greeks stayed, they would be trapped between two Persian armies and annihilated. Leonidas made a decision. He ordered most of the Greek force, several thousand men, to retreat immediately while they still could. He would stay behind with his 300 Spartans, along with about 700 Thespian volunteers and 400 Thebans, to hold off the Persians as long as possible and buy time for the retreating Greeks to escape. The decision was partially practical and partially cultural. Spartan military law and custom made retreat without orders from Sparta itself extremely difficult to justify. Leonidas may have believed that abandoning the position would disgrace him and his men. There's also a legend, reported by ancient sources, that the Oracle of Delphi had prophesied that either Sparta would be destroyed by the Persians or its king would die. If Leonidas believed this prophecy, his decision to stay and fight to the death might have been an attempt to save his city through his own sacrifice. On the morning of the third day, the Persians attacked from both sides. Leonidas and his remaining force fought with desperate courage, knowing they were going to die. Ancient historian Herodotus, who documented these events, wrote that by this point most of the Greek spears had broken, and the defenders were killing Persians with swords, and, when their swords broke, with their bare hands. Leonidas himself was killed in the fighting. The Spartans fought over his body, trying to prevent the Persians from capturing their king's corpse in a savage melee that Herodotus described as some of the most ferocious combat of the entire battle. 2 of Xerxes' own brothers died in the fighting over Leonidas's body. Eventually, the few surviving Greeks were overwhelmed and killed. The Persians had won the Battle of Thermopylae, but at enormous cost. The 3-day battle inflicted thousands of casualties on the Persian army and bought crucial time for the Greeks to prepare their defenses farther south. Most importantly, the heroic last stand at Thermopylae became a rallying point for Greek resistance. Later that year, the Persians were defeated in a naval battle at Salamis. The following year, they were decisively beaten in a land battle at Plataea. The Persian invasion of Greece failed, and Persian power in the Aegean never recovered. And Ephialtes, he never got his reward. After the Persian defeat at Salamis, Ephialtes fled into exile in Thessaly with a bounty on his head. The allied Greeks offered a substantial reward for his capture or death. He went into hiding, constantly moving, always afraid that someone would recognize him and claim the bounty. He lived this way for about 10 years. Finally, around 470 BC, according to Herodotus, Ephialtes was murdered by a man named Athenades of Trachis, apparently over an unrelated personal dispute that had nothing to do with his betrayal at Thermopylae. But the Spartans paid Athenades the bounty anyway, rewarding him for killing the traitor, even though that wasn't his original motive. Ephialtes' name became synonymous with treachery in Greek culture. The word itself came to mean nightmare in Greek, a linguistic legacy of his betrayal that persists to this day. His story became a cautionary tale about the consequences of choosing personal gain over loyalty to your people. He'd betrayed not just Leonidas and the Spartans, but all of Greece for the promise of Persian gold he never received. And in the end, he died in hiding, probably murdered in some back-alley dispute, while the men he'd betrayed were remembered as heroes for more than 2,000 years. But betrayal didn't just decide ancient battles. It shaped the fate of empires in the modern era. Let's move forward to October 1813, to the city of Leipzig in Germany, where Napoleon Bonaparte faced the largest and bloodiest single battle of his entire career, and where, in the middle of that battle, his allies pulled off a perfectly timed betrayal that sealed his fate. By 1813, Napoleon's dominance of Europe was collapsing. His catastrophic invasion of Russia the previous year had destroyed the Grande Armée. He'd entered Russia with 685,000 men. He came out with 120,000 cold, hungry, and traumatized survivors. That disaster shattered the myth of French invincibility. Subject nations and client states that had served France out of fear suddenly sensed weakness. They began looking for ways to abandon Napoleon and join his enemies. Napoleon rushed back to France and somehow managed to raise a new army of similar size to the one lost in Russia, though the new force lacked the experience and quality of the veterans who'd frozen to death on the retreat from Moscow. He marched this army into Germany to reassert French control. He won some battles through tactical brilliance, but he couldn't achieve the decisive victories he needed to break the coalition forming against him. His enemies learned to avoid fighting Napoleon directly while attacking his subordinate commanders, who lost more often than they won. By October 1813, the Allies felt confident enough to challenge Napoleon head-on. The showdown happened at Leipzig. Napoleon commanded about 225,000 men. Arrayed against him was a coalition force of 380,000 Russians, Austrians, Prussians, and Swedes. Despite being outnumbered, Napoleon believed he could win. He operated on interior lines, meaning he could concentrate his forces against different sectors of the enemy faster than they could reinforce, because his army was positioned inside the Allied encirclement. He planned to take the offensive, strike at weak points in the Allied line, achieve local superiority in numbers at the point of attack, break through, and destroy portions of the enemy army piecemeal. The plan might have worked. The first day of battle, October 16, 1813, ended in a hard-fought stalemate. Allied attacks were repelled. Napoleon's attempts to break through were contained. The second day saw limited action. By the third day, Napoleon was running critically low on ammunition and supplies. He prepared to withdraw his army in good order. He attempted to negotiate a truce that would allow him to retreat without further fighting. The coalition rejected the offer. Instead, they launched a massive attack all along the line on October 18th. The fighting was brutal. Napoleon's forces, stretched thin and running low on everything they needed, held their positions through sheer determination and tactical skill. The Allies couldn't break through despite their numerical advantage. The battle seemed headed for an exhausted draw, with both sides too weakened to continue. And then, in the afternoon of October 18th, everything fell apart for Napoleon because of a betrayal he never saw coming. A Saxon corps of about 10,000 men occupied a critical sector of Napoleon's defensive line. The Saxons were Germany's third-largest state and had been France's ally for years, providing troops for Napoleon's campaigns, including the disastrous invasion of Russia. But, like everyone else in Napoleon's coalition, the Saxons were reconsidering their loyalty now that French power was waning. They'd been in secret negotiations with the Allies for weeks, and they'd been waiting for the perfect moment to switch sides. That moment came on the afternoon of October 18th. Without warning, the entire Saxon corps abandoned their positions in Napoleon's line, marched out toward the Allied army, and defected to the coalition. They left a massive gap in the French defensive perimeter. Napoleon's forces, already stretched to breaking point, couldn't plug the hole. The Allies immediately poured troops through the abandoned sector. Napoleon's entire position became untenable. That night, he ordered a general retreat. The retreat started in relatively good order. French troops began withdrawing across the Elster River on the bridges leading out of Leipzig. But the following morning, October 19th, incompetence turned an orderly withdrawal into catastrophe. A French engineer, misunderstanding his orders or panicking under pressure, prematurely blew up the main bridge while it was still crowded with retreating French soldiers. The explosion killed hundreds of men instantly and stranded tens of thousands more on the wrong side of the destroyed bridge. Chaos erupted. Thousands of French soldiers, trapped between the river and the advancing Allied army, either surrendered or were killed. Some tried to swim the river and drowned. Others fought desperate rearguard actions before being overwhelmed. The Saxon betrayal and the botched bridge demolition transformed what might have been an arguable tactical draw into one of Napoleon's most catastrophic defeats. He lost more than 70,000 men at Leipzig, killed, wounded, or captured. His reputation suffered irreparable damage. Client states across Europe abandoned him. Within 6 months, Allied armies would be in Paris, and Napoleon would be forced to abdicate for the first time. The irony is that one of the coalition commanders at Leipzig, leading a Swedish army that helped defeat Napoleon, was a man who'd once been one of Napoleon's most trusted marshals, a man Napoleon had personally promoted, rewarded with titles and estates, and treated almost as a brother. Or a man who betrayed Napoleon so thoroughly that he ended up fighting against him at the battle that sealed his former patron's doom. Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte had been born in 1763 to a middle-class French family. His father was a prosecutor. Bernadotte enlisted in the army at 17 as a common soldier. When the French Revolution erupted, Bernadotte supported it enthusiastically. The revolution created opportunities for talented men without aristocratic connections, and Bernadotte proved very talented. He rose rapidly through the ranks, becoming a brigadier general by 1794. He developed a reputation as an excellent commander who kept his troops under tight discipline and got results in difficult situations. Bernadotte first encountered Napoleon Bonaparte in 1797 during the Italian campaign. The two developed what appeared to be a genuine friendship. Napoleon was still a general at that point, though clearly a rising star. Bernadotte was already well established in the Revolutionary Army. They respected each other's abilities. When Napoleon declared himself emperor in 1804, he appointed Bernadotte as one of the original marshals of France, the highest military rank in the French Empire. Napoleon rewarded Bernadotte further after the successful 1805 campaign that culminated in the Battle of Austerlitz, one of Napoleon's greatest victories. Bernadotte was made Prince of Pontecorvo, an Italian principality, giving him a title and estates that made him wealthy. But cracks in the relationship were forming. During the 1806 Prussian campaign, Napoleon severely criticized Bernadotte for failing to bring his corps to the battles of Jena and Auerstadt in time to participate. Napoleon believed Bernadotte had been moving too slowly, possibly deliberately, and nearly had him court-martialed for dereliction of duty. The friendship frayed further. Then, at the Battle of Wagram, in 1809, Napoleon relieved Bernadotte of command, accusing him of poor handling of his troops during the fight. Bernadotte was sent back to Paris under the face-saving pretext of health reasons, but everyone understood he'd been dismissed in disgrace. Bernadotte's career in France seemed finished. But then something extraordinary happened. The King of Sweden, Charles III, was elderly, unwell, and had no heir. Sweden needed a new crown prince, someone who could eventually succeed to the throne. Various Swedish factions proposed different candidates. One faction suggested Bernadotte, arguing that adopting a French marshal as heir would secure good relations with Napoleon's France, which dominated Europe at the time. In 1810, King Charles III formally adopted Bernadotte and named him Crown Prince of Sweden. Bernadotte assumed the regency and began governing Sweden while the elderly king lived out his final years. Bernadotte looked around for an accomplishment that would solidify his authority in his adopted country and establish his new dynasty. The opportunity came in 1812 when Napoleon's invasion of Russia ended in catastrophic failure. Suddenly, the French Empire looked vulnerable in a way it hadn't for years. Bernadotte saw his chance. In 1813, he signed a treaty with Britain, declared war on France, and led a Swedish army into northern Germany to join the coalition fighting Napoleon. At the Battle of Leipzig, Bernadotte commanded one of the Allied armies that converged on Napoleon's forces. The former marshal, who'd served Napoleon, who'd been promoted and enriched by him, who'd fought beside him in Italy and Germany, now fought against him at the bloodiest battle of the Napoleonic Wars. Bernadotte's Swedish troops participated in the assaults that helped crush Napoleon's army. The betrayal was complete. After Napoleon's defeat and exile, Bernadotte returned to Sweden as crown prince. When King Charles III died in 1818, Bernadotte became King Charles XIV, John of Sweden. He established the Bernadotte dynasty, which still reigns in Sweden today. The current King of Sweden, Karl XVI Gustav, is Bernadotte's direct descendant. The former French marshal who betrayed Napoleon created a royal dynasty that has lasted more than 200 years, while Napoleon died in exile on a remote island in the Atlantic Ocean. But some betrayals operated in the shadows, destroying empires not through battlefield victories but through stolen secrets. Let me tell you about Alfred Redl, an Austrian officer whose betrayal was so comprehensive, so devastating, that it may have helped cause World War I. Alfred Redl was born in 1864 in the Galician province of Austria-Hungary, in what is now Ukraine. His father was a railway clerk, a respectable position but not wealthy, and certainly without the family connections that typically opened doors to military careers in the aristocratic Austro-Hungarian Empire. Redl, however, was exceptionally intelligent and talented at languages. He secured a commission through merit rather than connections, a rare achievement. His facility with Russian led to his assignment to the intelligence branch of the Austro-Hungarian army. There, Redl impressed General August von Giesel, chief of military intelligence, who quickly made Redl his protege. In 1900, Giesel promoted Redl to deputy chief and placed him in charge of the entire Austro-Hungarian counterintelligence operation. Redl's job was to catch spies, to root out traitors, to protect the empire's secrets from foreign intelligence services. He revolutionized the department. He introduced new technologies like recording devices and cameras. He streamlined bureaucratic procedures. He built a reputation as one of the most innovative and effective counterintelligence chiefs in Europe. The Austro-Hungarian military establishment viewed him as brilliant, as the man who would protect their secrets from Russia, Germany, France, and Italy, all potential enemies in the complex web of alliances and rivalries that characterized early 20th century Europe. What they didn't know was that Alfred Redl was gay. In early 20th century Austria-Hungary, homosexuality was not just socially taboo. It was illegal. Discovery would mean the end of Redl's career, social ostracism, possible imprisonment. Redl kept his sexuality secret, but Russian intelligence learned about it. They compiled evidence. They obtained compromising photographs of Redl with other men, and then they approached him with an offer. The Russians could destroy Redl by exposing his sexuality, or Redl could work for them, provide them with Austrian military secrets, and receive money in exchange. The Russians sweetened the blackmail with generous payments. Redl accepted. In 1902, in his first major act of treason, he gave Russian intelligence the complete Austrian war plans for a potential conflict with Russia. When word leaked back to Austrian intelligence that the Russians somehow had a copy of Austrian war plans, General von Giesel ordered his deputy chief of counterintelligence, Alfred Redl, to find the traitor. Redl ran the investigation into his own betrayal. He needed to appear to be making progress while protecting himself from discovery. So, he unmasked minor Russian agents, people who'd been deliberately fed to him by his Russian handlers as sacrificial pawns. He also framed innocent Austrian officers with falsified evidence, creating scapegoats who were arrested and convicted based on the manufactured proof Redl provided. This enhanced his reputation even further. The high-profile arrests convinced the Austrian military establishment that Redl was absolutely brilliant at catching spies and traitors. For 11 years, from 1902 to 1913, Alfred Redl systematically betrayed Austria-Hungary to Russia. He sold them everything. He provided Austrian military ciphers and codes, which allowed the Russians to read encrypted Austrian communications. He gave them Austrian army mobilization plans, showing exactly how Austrian forces would deploy in the event of war. He provided maps showing Austrian fortifications, road and rail conditions, supply depot locations. He handed over reports on Austrian military readiness, equipment quality, and command structure. Every significant secret that passed through the Austro-Hungarian counterintelligence office went to Russia. Redl was paid well for his treason, allowing him to maintain a lifestyle far beyond what his official salary could support, including apartments in Vienna and Prague and a chauffeur-driven car. Redl's career of betrayal finally ended because his Russian handlers got sloppy. In 1912, General von Giesel was promoted to command an army corps and took Redl with him as chief of staff. Redl's successor in the counterintelligence office continued the work of monitoring suspicious communications. Postal sensors intercepted 2 envelopes addressed to a post office box in Vienna. The envelopes were thick and heavy. When opened, they contained large amounts of cash. The envelope's registration receipts were traced back to foreign addresses known to be used by Russian and French intelligence services. The new counterintelligence chief set up a sting operation. The envelopes were delivered under surveillance. For days, nobody claimed them. Then, on May 24, 1913, a man in a chauffeur-driven car showed up at the post office, picked up the envelope stuffed with cash, and drove away. Surveillance teams followed. They identified the car. They identified its owner. It was Colonel Alfred Redl, the former chief of counterintelligence, current chief of staff to General von Giesel, one of the most respected officers in the Austro-Hungarian army. Redl was arrested that evening at his apartment. When confronted with the evidence, he confessed almost immediately. The scale of his betrayal became clear as investigators went through his papers and questioned him. 11 years of systematic treason, every major Austrian military secret compromised. The Russians knew everything about Austrian capabilities, plans, and intentions. Redl had also spied for France and Italy, though Russia was his primary client. The Austro-Hungarian military command faced an impossible situation. A public trial would be humiliating, revealing the extent to which Austrian security had been compromised. It would expose the empire's military weakness to every potential enemy. It would also publicly reveal Redl's homosexuality, which the conservative military establishment wanted to avoid discussing. So they made a decision. Redl was taken to a room in a hotel and left alone with a revolver. The message was clear. He could commit suicide or face a very public trial followed by execution. Redl wrote brief farewell letters to his brother and to General von Giesel, the mentor he'd betrayed. Then he shot himself. The Austro-Hungarian Empire tried to suppress the story, but it leaked to the press within days. The scandal was enormous. One of Austria-Hungary's most senior intelligence officers had been a Russian spy for more than a decade. Every military secret was compromised. The empire's military plans had to be completely rewritten because the enemy knew them all. Historians have debated whether Redl's betrayal contributed to Austria-Hungary's poor performance in World War I, which began just a year after his exposure. When war did come in 1914, Russian forces inflicted devastating defeats on Austria-Hungary in the opening battles. Some historians argue that Russian knowledge of Austrian plans, provided by Redl, gave them crucial advantages. The empire never fully recovered from those early disasters. I have to pause here and ask you something. Alfred Redl was blackmailed with information that would have destroyed his career and possibly his life. He chose to protect his secret by betraying his country, selling military plans that may have led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of his countrymen when war came. If you were in his position, facing career-ending exposure, possibly imprisonment, social destruction, where would you draw the line? Would you betray your country to protect yourself? How far would you go to keep a secret that felt like it would destroy everything you'd built? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious where you would make that impossible choice, because what Alfred Redl did echoes through history as one of the most comprehensive individual betrayals ever documented. But Redl's betrayal operated in secret for years before being discovered. Some betrayals happen in full public view, where heroes become villains while the world watches in shock. Let me tell you about two men who went from being celebrated heroes of their nations to despised traitors who collaborated with their country's enemies. Marshal Philippe Pétain was born in 1856 in a small French village. He came from a modest background and entered the military through hard work and talent rather than aristocratic connections. His career progressed slowly for decades. By 1914, when World War I erupted, Pétain was 58 years old and a colonel, respectable but not particularly distinguished. But Pétain had developed theories about modern warfare that turned out to be correct when other French military doctrine proved disastrously wrong. He emphasized defense, arguing that attacking into machine gun fire and artillery barrages was suicidal. The French military establishment, which worshipped the offensive and believed that French élan, fighting spirit, could overcome any obstacle, considered Pétain's ideas defeatist. Then the war proved Pétain right, and the orthodox doctrine catastrophically wrong. He rose rapidly through the ranks as more aggressive commanders led their men to slaughter in futile attacks. In 1916, Pétain was appointed to command the defense of Verdun in what became the war's longest and bloodiest battle. German forces attacked Verdun for 10 months. More than 700,000 men were killed or wounded on both sides. Pétain organized the defense brilliantly, rotating units in and out of the fighting to prevent complete exhaustion, ensuring adequate supplies reached the front lines and maintaining morale under impossible conditions. Verdun held. The French repelled the German attacks. Pétain became a national hero, celebrated as the Lion of Verdun, the general who'd saved France. In 1917, after a catastrophically bungled French offensive led to massive casualties, widespread mutinies broke out throughout the French army. Soldiers refused to attack, though they agreed to continue defending their positions. The French military command faced potential collapse. They turned to Pétain, the general most trusted and beloved by common soldiers. Pétain restored order with a combination of carrots and sticks. He improved soldiers' living conditions, increased leave time, reduced pointless attacks, and addressed genuine grievances. He also had mutiny ringleaders executed, enough to re-establish discipline without creating martyrs. The approach worked. By war's end, Pétain was perhaps France's most respected military leader. 22 years later, in 1940, Nazi Germany invaded France. The campaign was a disaster for the French. Within 6 weeks, German forces had broken through French defenses, surrounded and cut off the main French armies, and were advancing on Paris. The French government collapsed. In desperation, they turned to 84-year-old Marshal Pétain and begged him to form a new government. Pétain accepted. He immediately sought an armistice with Germany. A junior minister named Charles de Gaulle urged continuing the fight from French colonies overseas, arguing that France could still resist even if the homeland was occupied. Pétain refused. He believed France had been definitively defeated and that further resistance was pointless. The armistice divided France. Germany occupied the northern two-thirds of the country, including Paris. Pétain's government controlled the southern portion from the city of Vichy. The Vichy regime, as it became known, collaborated with Nazi Germany. Pétain met personally with Hitler. Vichy France aligned itself with German interests. It actively opposed the French resistance and the Free French forces under Charles de Gaulle, who continued fighting from overseas. Vichy police helped German authorities round up French Jews for deportation to death camps. The regime implemented anti-Semitic laws without German orders, sometimes going beyond what Germany demanded. Pétain, the hero of Verdun, the man who'd saved France in World War I, was now collaborating with France's conquerors and helping them implement genocidal policies against French citizens. After the war, Pétain was tried for high treason alongside Pierre Laval, the other main collaborator in the Vichy government. Both were convicted and sentenced to death in 1945. Charles de Gaulle, now heading the French government, faced a painful decision. Pétain had saved France in World War I. He'd been a genuine hero. He was also 90 years old and had clearly betrayed France in World War II. De Gaulle commuted the death sentence to life imprisonment in recognition of Pétain's earlier service. The former marshal was jailed in a fortress on a small island off France's Atlantic coast, where he remained until his death in 1951 at age 95. Halfway around the world, another hero was making a similar journey from celebrated revolutionary to despised traitor. Wang Jingwei was born in 1883 in China during the final decades of the dying Qing dynasty. He was one of the bright young Chinese students sent abroad to study, and he attended university in Japan. There, he fell in with radical nationalist Chinese student circles. He became a disciple of Sun Yat-sen, the revolutionary leader who was organizing to overthrow the Qing dynasty and establish a modern Chinese republic. Wang Jingwei identified as an anarchist and became a prominent speaker advocating Chinese nationalism. In 1910, he was arrested for conspiracy to assassinate the Qing regent and thrown in prison. The Chinese Revolution of 1911 overthrew the Qing dynasty and ended more than 2,000 years of imperial rule. Wang Jingwei emerged from prison as a national hero, celebrated as a revolutionary who'd risked his life for China's freedom. The revolution led to chaos as warlords carved up the country. The Nationalist Party, called the Kuomintang, or KMT, was formed to restore order and reunify China under a strong central government. In 1925, Wang Jingwei became chairman of the national government. But the successful general who'd led the military campaign against the warlords, Chiang Kai-shek, formed a rival government in southern China. Wang Jingwei tried to govern in the north in collaboration with the communists, but that alliance collapsed. His government fell apart, and his supporters abandoned him to join Chiang Kai-shek. Wang Jingwei was bitter. He'd been a revolutionary hero, a leader of the nationalist movement, and now he was politically marginalized. The experience soured him. He abandoned his left-wing positions and became an extreme right-winger. When Japan invaded China in 1937, Wang Jingwei made a decision that would define his legacy forever. He flew to Hanoi to meet with Japanese representatives. He issued a declaration calling for peaceful negotiations with the invading Japanese forces. In 1939, he flew to Japan for direct negotiations with the Japanese government. There, Wang Jingwei betrayed China and negotiated a deal to head a puppet regime based in Nanking, the city that had been China's capital before the Japanese invasion. In 1940, Wang Jingwei officially defected to the Japanese. He became the nominal leader of a Japanese puppet government that claimed to govern the Japanese-occupied territories in China. The regime had no real power. All decisions were made by Japanese military authorities. Wang Jingwei was a figurehead who signed proclamations and gave speeches while Japanese forces committed atrocities throughout the occupied territories. The puppet government helped the Japanese exploit Chinese resources and labor. It collaborated in the suppression of Chinese resistance. Wang Jingwei, the revolutionary hero who'd fought to free China from the Qing dynasty, now served the foreign invaders who were destroying his country. Wang Jingwei remained Japan's puppet until his death from illness in 1944. He never admitted that collaborating with Japan was a betrayal. He argued until the end that he was trying to minimize Chinese suffering under occupation, that collaboration was better than continued warfare, that he was doing what was best for China. Almost nobody believed him. To most Chinese, both then and now, Wang Jingwei is simply a traitor, a man who abandoned his country in its darkest hour and helped foreign invaders destroy the nation he'd once fought to free. If you've made it this far, thank you for taking this journey through some of history's most devastating betrayals. This channel is dedicated to bringing you real stories every single day, the kind of history that shows you how power actually works, how trust gets weaponized, how a single decision can ripple through history and kill millions. We cover everything from warfare to politics to espionage to cultural revolutions. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time. Hit that button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Trust me, understanding these patterns of betrayal helps you recognize them when they happen in real time, when leaders make the same calculations that Stalin made, when heroes start their transformations into villains, when allies position themselves to switch sides at the perfect moment. So here's my final question for you, and I genuinely want your thoughts on this. Are there patterns to these betrayals that we should recognize? Stalin deluded himself that Hitler would honor their pact despite every warning. Hosts murdered guests who trusted their hospitality. Ephialtes betrayed his own people for gold he never received. Napoleon's Saxon allies waited for the perfect moment to maximize the damage of their betrayal. Bernadotte calculated that Sweden offered a better future than France. Redl chose personal survival over national loyalty. Pétain and Wang Jingwei convinced themselves that collaboration served their countries better than resistance. What do these betrayals teach us about human nature, about power, about when to trust and when to be skeptical? Drop your verdict in the comments below. These stories matter because the patterns repeat, because betrayal still shapes history, because understanding how trust gets broken helps you navigate a world where the stakes might not always be as high as World War II, but the principles remain the same. The deadliest betrayals in history teach us that trust is always a gamble, that even the most loyal allies can calculate that betrayal serves them better, that desperation, or bitterness, or blackmail, or simple greed can turn heroes into villains. Hitler's betrayal of Stalin nearly destroyed the Soviet Union and killed more than 25 million Soviet citizens in the war that followed. The Black Dinner's violation of hospitality shocked medieval Scotland and inspired fictional horrors centuries later. Ephialtes' treachery allowed the Persian Empire to nearly conquer ancient Greece. The Saxon betrayal at Leipzig accelerated Napoleon's fall and reshaped European politics. Bernadotta's switch from French marshal to Swedish king shows how betrayal can build dynasties. Redl's 11 years of espionage compromised Austria-Hungary so thoroughly that the empire may never have recovered. And Pétain and Wang Jingwei proved that even celebrated heroes can become collaborators if circumstances break them or bitterness consumes them. These betrayals changed history. They decided which nations would survive and which would fall. They determined who would die and who would live. They shaped the world we inherited. And they teach us that calculated treachery has always been one of the most powerful forces in human affairs, for better or worse, usually worse. The patterns are clear if you know how to look for them, and now you do.